This is a pivotal time in the climate movement. The decisions we make now about how and where we source our energy will impact generations to come. Continued expansion of the fossil fuel industry is not economically nor ecologically sustainable, and we've known for a long time now that burning fossil fuels is the main driver of the climate crisis. In the quest to seek clean energy sources, the ocean has massive potential and plays an important role in the necessary renewable energy transition. The power of waves, predictable tidal cycles, flowing stream water, and offshore wind are all major renewable energy sources in marine environments, as the force of water in motion can be harnessed to power homes, industries, and transportation. These technologies are developing rapidly across the globe, and the questions of how they will be deployed, who they will benefit, and how workers and communities are supported must be considered in a just transition. So, what does marine renewable energy look like? What is the status of their development in Canada? And how are folks building this industry in an equitable way? These are just some of the questions we'll try and answer today as we learn from experts about the power and potential of renewable ocean energy for a climate-resilient future. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of the BMSC Climate Action Series. We're so excited to have you here today for our very last episode of 2021 and to be joined by leading experts in the renewable ocean energy sector from across Canada. Yep, we got folks here from coast to coast. So it's my pleasure to start today by introducing you to Riley Richardson. Riley is a research scientist at the University of Victoria's Pacific Regional Institute for Marine Energy Discovery, where he did his master's research. Today, he has graciously offered to present on behalf of Marine Renewables Canada to introduce us to this topic. Thanks for joining us today, Riley. Please go ahead and start your presentation.
Thanks so much, Neri. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, as Neri mentioned, I'm a research scientist at Primed, and I'm just going to give a little overview on marine renewable energy. So as the name would suggest, marine renewable energy encompasses all renewable energy production derived from the ocean. And the development of MRE, like other renewables, is driven by the need to transition to geographically available renewable energy sources to mitigate climate change. So there's a massive theoretical global potential capable of supplying the entire world's electricity needs. The most advanced MREs in order are offshore wind, tidal energy, with tidal range being more advanced than tidal stream, and wave energy. And those are going to be the focus of today's presentations. You can see the huge difference in installed capacity down at the bottom of the slide between the three, with offshore wind being commercially viable, tidal stream being on the cusp of viability, with a lot of large projects coming online in the next few years. And then wave energy is about 5 to 10 years behind tidal, with most of the devices still being in a prototype phase. Then you can see, with the exception of offshore wind, which has a well-established and standardized design, thanks to the development of onshore wind, there's still many different designs for both tidal and wave. The basic principle of energy conversion from wind is a conversion of kinetic energy into electricity via the turning of rotor blades. And these turbines can be either mounted to the sea floor, or more recently, floating turbines have been developed, allowing for energy production in much deeper areas. Waves are also produced as a result of wind, as winds interact with the ocean surface, and the amount of energy stored in them is a function of wind speed, the duration, and the distance over which it's blowing. And it has many benefits over wind, being more consistent and having a higher energy density. And there's a lot of different designs, as you can see here, ranging from point absorbers, which capture energy as the waves move, to wave overtopping devices, which basically channel waves into a reservoir that then drives a turbine. And then conversely, tidal energy is driven by gravitational pull of the moon and the sun on the oceans. And it's predictable days, weeks, and even centuries in advance. And this inherent predictability makes it an extremely attractive energy source. So there's two types of tidal stream, which basically captures kinetic energy as ocean currents are channeled in between islands. And in these areas, you have increased flow that turns turbines similar to wind. And then tidal range, which essentially acts like a hydroelectric dam. So you allow water to fill up a reservoir, usually a blocked off estuary as the tide rises. You store this water as the tide recedes, and then use that potential energy difference between those tidal heights to drive a turbine. So some of the greatest benefits of marine renewables are their predictability and consistency, especially when you compare them to land-based renewables. They have a minimal environmental impact. They don't require large areas of land for which there's increasing competition among uses. And you don't suffer from as much not in my backyard opposition, as they're mainly out of sight, being underwater or located far offshore. They also provide the ability to generate power to the coast, where most of the global population lives, along with opportunities to power remote coastal and island communities. There are, however, still several challenges facing the development of the sector, and cost is a really big one for wave and tidal. As you can see, it's about 3 to 7 times as much as what you pay for your residential rate in BC. And other challenges include resource characterization and site identification, regulatory and policy frameworks for the sector, grid integration considerations, and survivability of devices due to the impacts of corrosion, biofouling, and the extreme forces acting on these devices due to a higher energy density. So there's many applications for marine renewables, far surpassing just providing power to homes and large-scale grids. One of the most promising markets within Canada is for powering remote communities and economic operations, that are currently reliant on fossil fuels. It can also be used to produce green hydrogen as a fuel source, something that is currently being trialed in Scotland, desalination, and to enable ocean observation in areas that are extremely expensive to monitor due to shipping operation costs. So within Canada, the MRE sector is truly spanning the country. We have research institutes, a world-class tidal test center, marine services, in addition to wind, tidal, and wave energy companies. And the economic potential of the sector is huge. And as Canadians, we have the opportunity to develop expertise, devices, and knowledge that we can export globally, along with applying MRE solutions to challenges we face internally. Thank you. That's the little brief overview.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Riley, to get us warmed up for this topic. Our next guest today is Natasha Legay, a program coordinator with the Ocean Startup Project. Joining us from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, Natasha is responsible for organizing projects like the Ocean Startup Challenge and supporting ocean tech companies in the renewable sector. Thanks for joining us today, Natasha. Please go ahead and start your presentation.
Thanks so much, Aniri. All right, so I'm here to talk a little bit about how the Ocean Startup Project supports innovative startups in the marine renewable space. So the Ocean Startup Project is a collaborative initiative driven by a vision to make Canada the best place in the world to start and grow an ocean company. We, along with partners and other supporters, are developing Canada's ocean startup ecosystem by providing support, guidance, and funding to early stage ocean tech companies. We focus on inspiring innovators to explore ocean opportunities, initiating new ocean companies, and investing resources into growth-oriented ocean ventures. And this last piece really relies on connecting these companies with programs and funds in the ecosystem that can fuel their growth. Since launching at the beginning of 2020, we've connected with and learned from many early stage ocean innovators. And what we've come to learn and understand is that we can make it easier for them to grow their companies faster by developing a stronger ecosystem in Canada, or an ocean startup ecosystem in Canada. But we're certainly not doing this alone. The logos you see here represent just a portion of the organizations across the country that are eager to support startup innovators, particularly in the marine renewable sector. So the Ocean Startup Project has 3 main initiatives to support entrepreneurs and startup teams. This includes our Lab to Market Oceans program, our Ocean Startup Challenge, and the Creative Disruptions Labs Ocean Stream. For the purposes of this presentation, I want to take the opportunity to highlight 2 of these initiatives that I feel are especially relevant to those with ideas for solutions in the marine renewable sector. So first up, we have our Lab to Market Oceans program. This intensive 7-week program is designed to help researchers and PhD students commercialize their technology. Teams are given up to $15,000 to help with the costs and time associated to undertake customer discovery and the validation of their idea. Lab to Market Oceans is a national program in scope. So if you're a researcher at a Canadian university who would like to explore whether there's a commercial opportunity for your technology, I highly encourage you to connect with us to learn more about the program. The next intake for Lab to Market Oceans will occur in 2022. I also wanted to highlight our Ocean Startup Challenge, which is designed to create and grow more early stage ocean companies in Canada. So along with funding, the challenge provides mentorship from industry experts, access to an executive in residence, as well as programming to help with some of those fundamental elements related to starting a business. We'll announce more details about our 2022 Ocean Startup Challenge in the coming months, but I encourage anyone who's interested in solving problems in the marine renewable space to check out our website, where you'll find some of the challenges industry has highlighted as big problems in need of solutions. I've included a few on this slide just to give you a sense of some of the opportunities to innovate in offshore marine renewables energy. As you can see, some of these opportunities include developing technologies that reduce risks to marine life, enable better decision-making, and support the monitoring of infrastructure offshore. So the last thing I wanted to mention is that the Ocean Startup Project is here to help. We would love to stay connected with you, and we really encourage anyone to reach out with any questions about our programs, or if you simply want to explore how we may be able to help you take your idea or research to the next level, please feel free to get in touch. Be sure to follow us on social media, join our mailing list, visit our website to stay up to date. I've also included my email for anyone, and I really encourage you to reach out, as we'd love to hear from you. And lastly, I just want to say thank you so much to the BMSC team for inviting me to speak today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for that great introduction of all the work happening around the country in the startup space. Our next presenter is CEO and president of Lunacy Solutions, one of the companies that was supported through the Ocean Startup Challenge. So Greg Trouse is an oceanographer, engineer, and waterman with over 20 years of experience in the tidal energy industry. So we're looking forward to hearing about his work through Lunacy Solutions, a company which supports tidal energy projects across the country. Thanks for joining us today, Greg. Please go ahead and start your presentation.
Let's get them to advance. There we go. So yeah, I work with 2 companies in the tidal energy space. One of them is called SOAR, or Sustainable Oceans Applied Research. And SOAR is a not-for-profit organization that I'm one of the founding directors for. And the big focus there is on collaborative research projects. I'm also the president and CEO of a company called Lunacy Solutions that's involved in the Ocean Startup Challenge. We're one of the winners for a technology that we're working on. And we are a for-profit company focused on oceanographic services and technology development. A lot of that is in the tidal energy space. So within tidal energy, we do services to the industry. A lot of this is, over the last decade, has been on site assessment, community engagement, involvement, marine operations. And our focus has been on community scale developments in the Outer Bay of Fundy, which I'll show on the next slide. I'll do a location map, but we've also been involved in some of the large scale developments at the Force site, which is better known. We've been doing a lot of applied research. A lot of it's been on turbulence, the effect of turbulence on tidal turbines, as well as environmental monitoring, looking at potential interactions between tidal turbines and marine animals. And how do we apply some of the things that we've learned in Nova Scotia to remote and, in particular, Indigenous communities that are reliant on diesel power? Also through Luna, we are quite active in technology development, and a lot of that is improving tools and methods for data collection, analysis, and visualization and presentation of data. So the locations where we've been working, the fourth site, which is shown in the blue square here, is the large development of Nova Scotia. That's meant to be multiple megawatts of energy. And then in the outer Bay of Fundy, or lower Bay of Fundy, shown here in this orange square, is where Petit Passage and Grand Passage are. And for the last 10 years, I've lived in, off and on, but primarily in a community here called Freeport, which is located between these two passages. We've got a lot of work done working with the community in that area. And they're really well-characterized sites that are now global focus areas for tidal energy development. So I thought I'd show some pictures of turbines getting deployed and recovered. This is some tidal operations that we helped with in the Midas Passage, so at the fourth site. And I'm showing this one to show a sense of scale. These are 2 megawatt turbines, so quite large, like meant to connect to a transmission grid and power like thousands of homes. This is the open hydro turbine being deployed behind a really large tugboat called the Atlantic Kingfisher. And something to pay attention to, because it'll show up again in my next slides, is this green boat alongside it. This is kind of small in class for a lobster fishing boat, but it's been converted to a survey vessel that we use in a lot of our work. This picture down below with a large barge with essentially a harbor tug with an Atlantic towing holding it in position. This is for the cable connection. So this is the size of the power cable to take power to shore from this turbine at the fourth site. This is Grand Passage, where we were working with Sustainable Marine Energy to deploy and operate their tidal platforms. In contrast, this is a system, it's a floating system, as you can see, that has 4 turbines on it. Underneath, you can see 1 turbine being installed here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one is 70 kilowatts. So the original system that went in was 280 kilowatts, and they're now testing a larger 420 kilowatt system. And on the picture, sort of in the bottom here, you can see that same green boat for a sense of scale. So it's a much smaller system that can be managed by more by like local vessels that you would find in Southwest Nova Scotia. Another project that we're involved in, this is in Petit Passage, so again in the Outer Bay of Fundy, is working with Nova Innovation. This project is in the earlier stages for Nova Scotia, but if you probably saw there for a minute at the beginning of my slide, I can see if I can restart it, a turbine spinning. That's a turbine that they have deployed in Shetland in the UK, so just sort of north of Scotland. In the project that they're looking at, and we're working on in Petit Passage, is a phased project planning to install 1 turbine, hopefully this year, followed by an additional 4, subject to additional approvals and environmental monitoring, and then potentially another 2 stages of 5 turbines each. On the research side of things is where we have a lot of fun on the water. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of our research is focused on turbulence, marine animals, and applying things in remote communities. A lot of pictures here of us doing boat work. The picture sort of in the center right top that shows a vessel with something yellow in the back of it. It's called the Jet Yak, and it's a remotely piloted or autonomous vessel that can go out and do surveys. So we've had a lot of fun testing that in tidal channels. And the 2 boats that are in the top banner there are 2 of our research vessels. The smaller one with the open boat is called the Puffin. The other one's the Grand Adventure, and we gear them up with all sorts of equipment for doing sonar investigations. The picture on the far right of the top banner there, that's a sonar image, is showing a humpback whale doing a back roll underneath my boat into a school of herring. So this was a pretty cool one to capture. Getting onto the technology side of things, Lunatide is a tidal current forecasting model that we've developed. This is a focus of our project with the Ocean Startup Project. The big picture is it shown being applied to the Midas Passage, Midas Channel, and most of the Bay of Fundy to do forecasting of tidal currents. It's got significant benefits over standard industry approaches, both in terms of the amount of data it needs and also its accuracy. Another technology that we're developing the primary target is remote communities, is drones and drifters, where we launch and work with community members in particular to launch consumer level drones, DJI drones like Mavics and Phantoms that a lot of people are familiar with, over a tidal or river channel, and georeference the images. And from those images, we're able to calculate flow speeds. The first example shown here is we used pumpkins for our initial test because they showed up really, really well on water. And you can see, like, I've just circled a pumpkin, and then our code just tracks it as it goes frame for frame and calculates the speed of the pumpkin, which is essentially the speed of the tidal parent. And then last but not least, we've got Luna Oceans, which you can find if you go to a website, lunaoceans.com, and it's a method for sharing oceanographic data. The picture on the top left is sort of what you'll see when you land on the page, with all sorts of different layers. As you zoom in, it all kind of declusters into data points, and then you can click on them to get wave conditions, tide conditions, photos of interesting beaches that you could go to when you visit Nova Scotia. So as well as BC, we're also going coast to coast and populating areas down throughout the US and the UK. So please check it out. And that's all my slides for now. Thanks for the opportunity to present.
Thanks so much, Greg. Wow, it seems like there's a lot going on at Lunacy Solutions. And I remember watching a video about Drones and Drifters project, and we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes so other people can learn more about what you're doing at Lunacy. Our next guest today is Delia Warren, an expert in offshore wind energy and ambassador for Iron and Earth, which is a Canadian nonprofit that supports fossil fuel industry workers transitioning to jobs in the renewable sector. She has personal experience transitioning from the oil and gas industry into the renewable oceans sector. And although she couldn't join us live today, we're really excited to share a conversation we had with her where she shares her experience and recommendations for a just transition in Canada and how marine renewables fits into that. Thank you, Delia.
Yes, thanks so much, Neri. It's my pleasure to be here today. Okay, so I guess I started off graduating with a degree in mechanical engineering and going directly into the offshore oil and gas industry. So I started off as a subsea structural engineer, even though I did always have a passion for renewable energy and wind energy in particular. So I worked for about 7 years in that industry, and then I decided that I'd go back and get an MBA. And this was a result of just wanting a change, and also there was a downturn in oil prices. So there were a lot of oil industry layoffs at the time. So I basically wanted to get ahead of that and get some new skills. So after I joined the MBA program, I got laid off pretty much immediately and decided that was the time I was going to make the switch into renewable energy. So just by happenstance, I met somebody from Iron and Earth. They were looking for a new director for their Eastern chapter based in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. So I ended up taking on that role, working with them for a number of years. I then worked for a company based out of Clarenville, Newfoundland and Labrador, that did smaller scale renewable energy projects. And I am currently living in Boston, working for a global energy consultancy company in the offshore wind industry in the United States. So I'm a lead energy or renewable energy consultant.
Now, you mentioned that you were the East Coast director for Iron and Earth. Could you tell us a bit more about what is that organization and what they do?
For sure. So Iron and Earth is an organization that seeks to build a bridge between workers in the fossil fuel industry or other extractive industries and the renewable energy industry and clean tech industries. Since we started, so the organization was relatively new when I joined back in 2016. Since then, they've grown to include representing Indigenous peoples and working with Indigenous communities as well to guide the transition. But I think that the main focus of the organization is working towards a just transition. So supporting fossil fuel industry workers, supporting Indigenous communities, through the transition away from oil and gas and towards a clean energy future.
Very cool. I was wondering if you could share, either through your personal story or with your work through Iron and Earth, how was it in terms of transferable skills moving from one industry into the other, and how does Iron and Earth support either skills or training or any kind of development for workers?
For sure. So basically, when I worked in offshore structural engineering, I mean, so many of the skills I developed are directly applicable in the offshore wind industry in terms of design. I mean, when you're designing subsea structures, the end goal, or the ultimate use of that piece of equipment is not really necessarily your focus. It's just, how do we design the steel to do this job? And it's the same in offshore wind. A lot of the structures that are used as foundations for the offshore wind turbines are almost identical to structures that are used in oil and gas, the sea fastening for transportation installations. I mean, there are so many transferable skills. I don't know if I would be doing the job I am right now in offshore wind if I hadn't had that experience in offshore structural engineering in the oil and gas industry. So you do see a lot of people coming through and transferring those skills. And one of the things, or one of the main things that Iron and Earth does, is identifies parallel skills between the oil and gas industry and the renewable energy industry, because it's the same for many of the trades, for a lot of the professional roles, even for labor type positions. There are very, very close skill requirements for both industries. So we do recognize that in some cases there needs to be some upskilling, so some additional skills gained or additional training, and beyond on-the-job training that is often sufficient. Iron and Earth is aiming to provide some short-term training programs. So they have one for solar and they have one for wind. And that's basically, a way to fill any skills gaps that might exist and ease that transition for anybody looking to move away from fossil fuels and then into the renewable energy industry.
I was wondering if you could comment on what's the status of offshore wind energy in Canada, and where do you think it's going, or what do you think needs done to make it happen?
So in Canada right now, we don't have any operating offshore wind projects. I think, to the best of my knowledge, there is a plan in place to develop a project off of the West Coast near Haida Gwaii. I don't think that project is very far along, and I'm not entirely certain what level of development that's at. But basically, Canada is a bit constrained in terms of offshore wind development because of the lack of a regulatory framework. So a mechanism for permitting for these offshore wind projects isn't in place, and that's something that's absolutely critical before offshore wind projects can actually be built. There have also been some question marks around route to market, or where is this energy going to go? I think that question has largely been answered. There are lots of jurisdictions within Canada that could benefit from clean energy. There's an export market to the US that could also benefit from clean energy, as well as right now, the hot new energy topic is hydrogen generation, or green hydrogen. So it could even be used to generate green hydrogen for export to anywhere in the world, really. So in the United States, where I work right now, the offshore wind industry is absolutely booming. They don't even have one commercial scale offshore wind project built yet, but there are, 40 gigawatts of offshore wind in the planning, or the goal currently is for about 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2040, 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And just to put that into context, right now, globally, there are about 33 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity installed. So essentially, the United States is looking to cram, 30 years of development in the next 9 years to meet that goal. And there's projects right up and down the East Coast. So, right now there's a huge opportunity for Canadian companies to support the projects in the United States, either through expertise, to form partnerships, to provide vessel support, or even to provide staging and marshalling. So basically storage space and installation ports that can then be used to service the offshore wind industry in the United States, because the opportunity is absolutely massive. They refer to it as a once in a generation opportunity down here. So I think Canada is starting to notice all the activity that's taking place down here, and I really would like to see some development taking place, especially on our East Coast. I'm an East Coaster from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, so I would love to see some of that actually taking place at home. I think we're really well positioned to benefit from it.
So in terms of the regulatory framework that's lacking, is that something that's lacking provincially or federally or both in Canada?
Well, I think there needs to be a fair bit of collaboration between the federal government and the provincial governments in order to establish a framework. I know in the United States, pretty much every project that is in planning right now is in federal waters, so it's governed by their Federal Bureau of Offshore Energy Management. And the permitting process is significant. It's a long, drawn-out process. You have to do a lot of environmental reviews. There's lots of back and forth between the regulators and the companies. So this is an absolutely critical step if we ever hope to develop. But it was challenging when we started developing offshore oil and gas in Eastern Canada, and we found a way to make it work. And I'm sure we can do that in Canada as well for offshore wind. It just is going to take, some political will to get it done, and a real, drive by the people. The government is for the people. So if we tell the government that's what we want, then, that they will put the time and energy into it. I know it was a real concerted effort in the United States, and a lot of attention and investment was diverted intentionally into improving that process. And there's a system of continuous improvement right now. If they're going to get the target or reach the targets that they've set for offshore wind development here, they do need to speed up the permitting process. So it's still, intention will lead to results, I think, in Canada.
In terms of environmental impact, what are some of the environmental concerns in terms of offshore wind and some of those potential solutions?
There is a very long environmental impact assessment process, surveying, environmental monitoring and modeling that goes along with these offshore wind projects in the early days and then continuously throughout the entire project lifetime. And this is a legitimate concern for other ocean users and for the people developing these offshore wind farms as well. So a lot of attention is paid to how to minimize environmental impact. So I think, obviously the impact on seabirds, sea life, marine mammals, fisheries, all of that is being studied and reported on continuously for these projects. Thus far, there is an impact on, seabirds if they fly into the structures. But studies have shown that compared to in a big city where you've got tall buildings, and birds are flying into buildings, it's much less of an impact. So, there are sensitive areas with respect to migratory bird patterns or marine mammal migrations. And the general rule of thumb is just place the wind farms so that they have as minimal of an impact as possible on these environmental systems. There's also been a real drive to work with fisheries to place the wind farms as well and to mitigate the impacts on that industry. For instance, the first commercial scale project being built in the US, Vineyard Wind, they've got a minimum spacing of, I think, a mile between each of the offshore wind turbines so that they can ensure, adequate space for other industry activity and passage of vessels and that type of thing.
Thank you. You have such an inspiring story as somebody who's lived this just transition. What advice would you have for workers who are interested in entering the renewable market, whether that's marine renewables or renewable energy further inland?
For sure. I think the first thing I'd say is, to come into the industry with an open mind. There has been in the past a perception that, the renewable energy industry is, environmental activists that are, they've got their head in the clouds, or, that renewable energy is a fad, or that, it doesn't work in the long term, or it's going to wreak havoc on our transmission systems. And I think time has shown that none of that is true. These are real industrial, large-scale operations with massive manufacturing and construction components. And a lot of the jobs from one industry are not going to be very much indistinguishable from another. It's all about getting energy to people's homes, and in the meantime, decreasing our emissions. Another trend that I've observed in the offshore wind industry, and I know this is true in a lot of the other renewable energy industries as well, is a real push for union labor, or at least having labor agreements that are really beneficial to the workers, that ensure minimum benefits and protections in all sorts of areas. So that has been a really big movement in the United States, basically looking to make these offshore wind projects as equitable overall as possible. So looking at project labor agreements with unions, also a major focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the industry. So making sure that social justice actions are incorporated in communities that have traditionally been marginalized or have felt the biggest impacts from climate change or from emissions and air pollution, are actually benefiting from these projects. So being the first considered for training and jobs, and making sure that local companies are contracted as often as possible to do whatever work that they're able to do. This has been a real focus for the industry. So I think, I've kind of seen the move towards just transition and, away from fossil fuel reliance as a way to kind of reset the energy industry as well, and to make it more fair and more just for everyone that's involved.
Thank you so much, Delia. We're going to end today with a brief presentation from Riley Richardson again, sharing some of the work going on at the Pacific Regional Institute for Marine Energy and Discovery. All right, welcome back, Riley. We're excited to hear about what's happening on the West Coast.
Thank you so much, Ineri. Just get it started here. All right, so a little background. Primed is a research lab hosted by the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at the University of Victoria. And we're primarily focused on client-driven research to enable marine renewable energy development on the BC coast. In order to do so, we provide a range of services from resource characterization to device modeling, cost analyses, field monitoring, and more. So BC has a significant marine renewable energy resource. However, as mentioned previously and in the other presentations, despite the potential, there are still many obstacles impeding the development of the industry. So these range from costs to regulatory frameworks, with a critical challenge being the characterization of resources at high resolution in order to identify development opportunities. So I'm going to start by covering how we characterize these resources. And as illustrated by this Irina quote, this is imperative precursor to making headway on these subsequent challenges. Then I'll provide an overview of one of the projects we're currently working on and illustrate how Primed and others are working on the broader challenges facing the sector. So firstly, the question is, how do we get from the large theoretical resource values I mentioned earlier to a scale at which decisions can be made? That is, how do we get from the raw resource to the identification of viable project sites? So the theoretical resource requires extensive data collection of meta-ocean conditions and iterative refinement of models in order to increase resolution. The technical resource requires the screening out of constraints such as minimum viable current speeds, wave energy flux, bathymetry, and more. And then finally, the practical resource requires that you screen the technical resource by including socioeconomic uses, marine spatial planning, tenured areas, ecological value, and regulatory requirements. So in order to gain certainty on the theoretical resource, Prime deploys multiple buoys and sensors along the West Coast and internal channels, in addition to utilizing data sets from the DFO, NOAA, and other global data sources. So these deployments and the leveraging of those other sources, such as bathymetry data, provide a range of inputs to inform our resource characterization and modeling. There's two primary models used by Primed. One developed by the National Research Council of Canada, providing information on tidal current speeds, and another developed by Primed that illustrates wave energy flux along the West Coast. So there's many inputs that go into the wave energy model, for instance, such as sea state data from global models, along with wind, wave, and tidal data from buoys, and bathymetry data from the CHS. We also provide more refined modeling for specific projects, and this includes additional data inputs such as locally deployed buoys, tidal heights, and advanced wave physics. So now that the resource has been quantified, we can start applying some technical constraints and moving towards identifying those practical resources. So shown here is an example of a student, Linda Zhu, for her master's thesis. She identified wave sites by combining the technical resource with socioeconomic uses in order to identify strategic wave sites. And those are sites that are good from the perspective of all stakeholders. So our work was primarily focused along the west coast of Vancouver Island and considered levels of goodness based on different stakeholder perspectives by combining wave resource with marine conservation value, fisheries catch value, and vessel traffic, along with electricity demand centers for both grid connected and remote communities. So I actually did some similar work for my master's thesis, but it was focused on identifying tidal sites for remote coastal diesel-reliant First Nations communities. And you can see here the range of different socioeconomic criteria I considered, in addition to those technical constraints and hard constraints such as parks and tenured areas. I also included interviews with marine spatial planning leads and remote communities in order to better inform what site goodness means to stakeholders. Now, what can you do with these findings? So identification of these resources coincides with several provincial goals and targets. Firstly, Clean BC initiatives to reduce emissions in BC, especially through the electrification of transportation and industry. And then as the population grows, especially on the South Coast, there's a need to meet increased electricity demand within the next 20 years. And marine renewable energies allows for the development of generation assets near BC's largest population centers, rather than hundreds of kilometers away on the Peace and Columbia rivers. And it also creates a more resilient and diversified grid. And then, as kind of alluded to earlier, the most promising short-term market for marine renewable energy due to high electricity costs is achieving diesel reductions and transitioning to geographically available renewables in off-grid coastal communities. So in this regard, Prime kind of acts to support communities in their pursuit of energy sovereignty by providing resource assessments and baseline feasibility studies, along with third-party assessments of developers' devices, insulating communities from becoming test sites for energy devices, and ensuring communities can make informed decisions on energy systems. As an example, one of the most prominent projects we're currently working on is with the Moatchit-Muchelit First Nation and their traditional village of Yuquot on Nootka Island. So Yuquot's actually a National Historic Site, being the first location of contact between Captain Cook and First Nations on the West Coast. But by the 1950s, most of the population was forced to move to larger centers with the promise of jobs and services, and there's only about 2 community members living there year-round. But it's the ancestral home of the MMFN, and they have aspirations to develop Yuquot in order to go home. And this is going to require electricity to facilitate a modern revitalization of the site. And wave energy was identified in 2018 by the nation as a promising source of energy. So we're currently working with the MMFN, Barclay Project Group, EDI, and INGEN on what's called the front-end engineering and design study in order to assess the project's feasibility. And this study is structured to bring the project to the development phase, at which point the MMFN can make an informed decision whether to proceed with the project. So activities we've completed thus far include site selection, the deployment of 2 wave buoys for higher resolution resource characterization, preliminary environmental assessments, and a multi-beam bathymetry survey you can see here to get some certainty on the site. So in order to kind of assess different technologies, we use comprehensive design modeling, especially using DSA's Protus DS. And in this case, we're modeling the mooring lines and INGEN's power takeoff system in order to optimize the wave energy converter. We're also undertaking an economic analysis of the device to provide the MMFN with a second opinion on project costs. And then a critical challenge for renewables more broadly is managing intermittent energy sources. In order to alleviate some of these issues, We're undertaking microgrid and hybrid renewable energy system modeling for UQuat and other projects. And this is to determine how do you balance load and demand, the optimal capacity of different energy sources and storage systems, decisions on when to use or to store power, and how to manage these different energy inputs. We're also working with BMT on a standardized microgrid controller and interface unit. And the goal is to make something that can be adapted to various community specifications to ease integration challenges and reduce costs. And then finally, we've recently built a test facility to research battery systems and to better inform the storage components of this modeling. Another challenge, as mentioned, is regulation of the industry. And despite some available provincial guidance documents, the regulation for permitting of marine renewable energy in BC is currently unclear. And to overcome this, we held a workshop in September to bring together project partners with pertinent regulators at both the provincial and federal level to help the MMFN through the permitting process, align the project with multiple levels of government priorities. And an end goal is to kind of build upon the existing documents and guide future marine renewable energy developments in BC while also advancing this project. We're also going to be undertaking additional engagement with stakeholders over the next year to inform a set of recommendations that we'll submit to provincial regulators. And so even at this early stage, with most of the projects in BC being focused on smaller scale projects, there's a multitude of companies and agencies that are involved, and the development of the industry will be incremental and iterative, and it's going to require collaboration between academia, government, and the private sector in order to establish supply chains and necessary marine services in BC ahead of what I hope will be commercial scale applications and developments within the next decade. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present.
Yes, thank you so much, Riley. Wow, I'm just blown away by all of your presentations, and it's clear that this is highly collaborative. So we are entering our Q&A period right now. So if any of the audience members have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. But just to start, recently, Marine Renewables Canada had a national conference bringing together all of these different groups, academia and startups and research. So I'm curious, from each of your perspectives, what were the main takeaways and what would you like to see more of to support your work? So we'll go from the top. So I'll start by asking Natasha.
Thanks, Aniri. So I didn't actually attend the conference, but I think generally speaking, anyone who cares about climate change and will appreciate that there is a need to decarbonize and to reach a zero emission goals that we've set. I think from my perspective, marine renewable energy offers a way to progress us towards these targets and presents a really unique opportunity for workers kind of who spent their careers in extractive energy sectors to transition their careers by applying skills and knowledge to a more sustainable industry. I also think that marine renewables offer an opportunity to have greater participation from Indigenous communities. A lot of that was highlighted in some of the presentations today. And perhaps other, so I guess, yeah, I think the increased participation and increased equity and inclusion in some of these big projects is really important. And I think, you know, any sector that provides a more inclusive and sustainable future for our communities is really the only way forward.
Well, thank you, Natasha. Greg, did you have any thoughts on this?
I missed the conference as well. But in terms of support for work, I mean, a couple of overarching things that I think need to be priorities in the tidal power industry is focusing on what we need to do to get electrons to grid. We need to get tidal power to shore and show that it can be reliable and an effective means of powering communities. We've done a lot of research and a lot of talk over the last decade, but that really needs to happen soon. And in partnership with that, we need primarily funding support for effective and unbiased environmental monitoring. That's a big piece that's needed to inform policy. A lot of people have talked about policy today, and the need for a clear framework for permitting, and that policy needs to be based on reducing uncertainty and better understanding how tidal turbines and other marine renewable energy devices interact with marine life.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Greg. Riley, did you have any thoughts on this, and what would you like to see prioritized to support the work going on at Primed?
Yeah, I think one of the main things we've started to run into is there's not a lot of inclusion of international standards. So they exist through the International Electrotechnical Commission, but regulators aren't aware of them yet. So that's something we're trying to work on when we're updating the regulatory framework, is aligning things with the international community, which will make it a lot easier for developers and other companies to collaborate with Canadian companies. So I would say that's a really big one. And another is just getting devices in the water. So it's been shown through global research over the past 20 years that if you have a single wave or tidal device, the environmental impacts are negligible or extremely small. But we still find regulators are risk adverse, and they might put too big of an onus on these small scale projects, which end up, they never make it into the water, and we're not able to progress to that next stage.
Thank you. On that note, we have a question from one of the audience members for Greg, and they're wondering if tidal energy can affect local tide levels, and does that have an effect on organisms in the intertidal zone or on intertidal ecosystems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I saw that one pop up. There are studies from back even a few decades ago when people were talking about large-scale tidal energy developments in the Bay of Fundy that show that if you extract gigawatts of tidal energy from the Bay of Fundy, it could have negative impacts as far Farfield as Boston, actually increasing water levels and flooding Boston Airport. But we are so far from doing anything anywhere close to that. And we're talking about kilowatts and potentially, hundreds of megawatts of development. And I think that in the next, 5 to 10 years that it will take to achieve those levels, we'll much better understand both like the Farfield effects, as well as I mentioned before, the need to do some focused environmental monitoring on interactions with, as Riley pointed out, single turbines are really low risk, but small arrays, we need to better understand what the effect of that is.
Interesting. I'm curious, just from a pretty basic question here. What is that? Can you put that into context of what do hundreds of megawatts look like? Like how much power does it take to power like a small sized city in Canada, for example?
For somebody other than me.
As a rule of thumb, I usually say that a megawatt would power about 1,000 homes for average Canadian homes. Then again, it gets into a whole bunch of nuances with capacity factors and things of that nature, but 1 megawatt, 1,000 homes.
1,000 homes. Okay, good to know. Interesting. Riley, we actually have a question specifically about the West Coast, but how soon will there be significant contribution from marine energy on the West Coast? And James Wright just asked this question.
The way BC Hydro is going right now, never. But so that's something we're working on, because we had a whole bunch of clean action power calls in the early 2000s that were essentially scrapped in the past decade. So nobody is actually able to install a device and sell power into the grid. There's a big movement by First Nations to create a First Nations power authority that would be able to sell power into the grid. And something Prime's, it's a report I'm actually working on right now, is to include these marine renewable energies within our supply stacks moving forward over the next 20 years. So it all depends on how that sort of regulatory discussion works out with BC Hydro. And if companies are able to sell power directly to the grid, then you could see a build out of devices and whatnot. If BC Hydro decides they can't, then there's no real avenue to get very large scale commercial arrays going.
What do you think is the barrier there? Or is there a way folks can engage to encourage BC Hydro or elected officials to consider this option?
I think one of the biggest ones, you look at ecological issues in BC, southern resident killer whales, declining salmon populations. One of the big three reasons for salmon populations declining is our large-scale hydroelectric facilities, which are a great way to produce power, but they have a lot of environmental impacts beyond what might be seen as emissions. So as we move out over this next century, I think it's creating a more resilient and diversified grid. For example, meeting that energy demand on the South Coast, you look at Vancouver Island, you're a few hundred kilometers away from the Peace and Columbia rivers, and then subsea cables take that energy across the Strait of Georgia to Vancouver Island. If you're able to produce power from wave arrays, say off of Tofino, that are powering Vancouver Island, I think that's a great way to go about it. And people can be passionate and advocate about having electricity being produced closer to themselves and also having a more diversified grid.
Thank you. Now, Riley and Greg, you've both sort of touched on how both your companies and organizations facilitate community-led energy projects. So I'm curious if you have any lessons that you'd like to share with everyone about how you sort of engage in those projects to make sure they're community-led and to not engage in like helicopter science. Greg, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, our approach was really moving into the community and becoming part of it. That's not necessarily something you can replicate everywhere, but we did learn a lot. And sort of the key things that it kind of boils down to me is respect, of course, being the big one for other water users, as people, but like more importantly, well, not more importantly, but like for our work is their knowledge. And what local knowledge holders already know about tidal flows, seabed conditions, marine life, the areas that they use, all of these things. The next thing is really meaningful involvement in the projects, not just sort of community engagement, but community involvement is key. And also a huge thing is, of course, people's existing livelihoods and really taking that into account and making sure that what you're proposing is going to be beneficial to the community and not putting what they currently do at risk.
Totally, yeah. Riley, are there any lessons that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'd say for most of the projects we work on, we're approached by nations that are looking to get off of fossil fuels. So they have available marine renewable energy. So we're approached, and then it's also good because Primed is a non-for-profit. So we don't have any skin in the game. We just provide a scientific overview of what the resource looks like, give them an estimation of costs. But as Greg was saying, including traditional ecological knowledge and site selection, ensuring that these devices will fit with the existing way of life in the community, that's very paramount.
Thank you. Natasha, I was curious, you sort of have a bird's eye view of ocean tech companies in your role, and I'm curious if you've seen an increase in ocean tech within the renewable sector or other indirect industries growing as a result of ocean renewables growing.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Miri. We're certainly seeing more startups across all ocean sectors, but I think particularly what's really exciting is we're seeing more innovative entrepreneurs and teams gravitate towards marine renewables because they're drawn to the opportunity to contribute to sustainability. I think that's a big piece of why people are looking to solve problems in that sector. We're particularly inspired by the technologies that enable many of these indirect sectors, such as data-driven companies like what Greg is working on, and that are providing really valuable information to industry. In addition to data, we're seeing technology trends such as sensors, materials, autonomy. They're all impacting the types of solutions and companies that are coming up, this type of solutions that companies are coming up with. In our most recent Ocean Startup Challenge, as an example, we have companies who are working to reduce noise for offshore wind developments, as well as companies who are developing innovative coatings that can be applied to underwater turbines. So there's a really exciting next generation of these early startups coming up that are solving some big problems in the industry.
Thank you. Wow, I could keep asking you questions forever, but I am mindful of our time. I I just want to say thank you to everyone, our speakers and guests, for coming today. It's hard to believe we're about just over halfway through the BCAS series. So if you haven't had a chance to see any of our previous 7 episodes, we're going to put the link for that playlist in the show notes. You can follow the Banfield Marine Sciences Center on YouTube and see all kinds of things happening here. And just to end, of course, we're going to end with our climate action recommendations. It's clear from all of our speakers today that there's a lot of want, but a lack of a regulatory framework to actually increase the scale of ocean renewables in Canada. But the good news is there's a lot of countries, particularly in Europe and Asia, where these are being scaled up. So we know it's possible. And as highlighted today, it's important to consider the social implications. So we're going to link to some of the articles that we've read that we've learned from, and to Iron and Earth, where you can learn more about how to support workers and communities in this just transition. And secondly, we all use energy in our homes, in our works. So take some time to learn a bit about the grid that you're hooked up to, or if there are renewable energy projects in your community, whether that be on a coast or even inland. And one great resource the Indigenous Clean Energy Project created is an interactive map. So you can zoom in, you can see where you are and see what kind of Indigenous-led energy projects, clean energy projects, are happening near you. And finally, Canada is in the process of developing its ocean strategy. So this is sort of analogous to what's being developed in the US called the Blue New Deal, but in Canada it's called the Blue Economy Strategy. And although the public consultation period is over for that, you can still write to your MP and encourage them that you want to see marine renewables prioritized in this strategy. So as a holiday present to you, we're going to draft up a template letter that you can use to send to your MP. And while you're at it, you can even ask for the Just Transition Act to be legislated. And our next episode is in 2022. That's the first time I've said that out loud, 2022, next year. So we'll see you on Wednesday, January 19th. We're going to explore coastal ecosystem restoration and the potential of carbon sequestration. And of course, we'll end today with our energy joke. So what did the wind, tidal, and wave turbine say to the engineer? Ordinary. I'm a big fan. Yes, so with that, thanks so much for joining us today, folks. We'll see you next time.